Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we're looking at Acts chapter 12, and there is unfortunately another martyr that is recorded. And there's also a pretty significant prison break. At this point in the book of Acts, Peter's getting pretty good at disappearing from prisons. And it seems silly that so many people think that they, again, can stop what God is doing just by using prisons, which already have proven to be not very effective.
Well, I actually was a little confused in some parts too. We were talking about James. Apparently James gets killed at the beginning, and then there's another James at the end, which is slightly confusing.
He did not magically come back. It's just that James, a lot of these names are actually very common names. Like Simon's very common, James is very common, Mark is very common.
Yeah.
So it can be difficult to, actually Judas is a common name, so it's hard to sort them all out.
Well, I think what's really cool about today is, like you were saying, this prison break that Peter undergoes. It's just crazy. Like, if that was real life, I would certainly be second guessing myself the entire time. And then when I find the place that I'm trying to get to after I break out of prison, I would be banging the door down. There's no way I'd be just standing there waiting for some little girl named Rhoda to go and tell everybody.
Poor
I'd be
Rhoda.
jumping through the windows. No thanks. I'm not standing out here any longer.
Okay, so just to set this up, Herod decides to kill James and realizes that a lot of the Jews are really happy with this situation. They're
Of course they are.
quite pleased to see these Christians who they saw as
Threats.
but revolutionaries kind of or whatever. So they're really happy to see the pressure put on them. And so he continues this by putting Peter in jail. Now this Herod title, just kind of for extra credit, it's a Herod that orders all the babies killed when Jesus is born.
Same guy.
No, it's not the same guy.
I was like, wait, what? That seems like a significant period of time.
It's a family name. So it's Herod that has the babies executed when Jesus is born, when he's around 2 or whatever. It's Herod that has John the Baptist put in prison, ultimately kills John the Baptist. It's Herod here that kills James. It is like a family name. It's like a title of authority.
Herod the 12th.
There could be 2 Herods. There could be 3 Herods. There's some debate about who is who. So do not fall into the common misconception that this guy has been around forever.
It's quite easy to, because they're all super violent. They're all in charge, and they're all going after the same types of people. So I'm not surprised.
So the first thing that happens is Herod puts James to death. What's interesting, obviously that is very unfortunate, but what's interesting about that, this is James and John, the sons of thunder. You'll remember from back in the Gospels that it was their mother and then themselves who were asking for places of authority.
Right.
She was saying, hey, can they sit at your left and your right? And Jesus says, I don't think you guys are ready to drink the cup that I'm going to drink. Yeah. And here we have James drinking the cup that Jesus had to drink. And so in some ways, Jesus did kind of cue them into what might happen in the future. And here this is happening. So you can see this thread of persecution kind of getting more and more intense. And here, one of the key leaders of the early church is being executed, and then Herod intends to continue this with Peter. You can tell that the early church assumed that Herod was going to continue this, because when Peter shows up, they actually think it's his angel, not actually Peter himself. So the early disciples, the early followers of Jesus, they assumed that Peter had already been put to death.
Crazy thing too, Herod is called out as a god, which is really awkward too, because he's doing all these things that they want. So it's gross on 2 very different spectrums, because one, Herod is just a guy that is interested in being popular and praised by the constituents, I guess. And then the people, oh my gosh, shame on them. They are supposed to be these God honoring followers and representations to the world, and they are literally calling him a god.
Okay, so this is important to recognize as well, because it does kind of come out of nowhere. It's just wait, there's this short little story about Herod and he's put to death by God. One of the things that's happening here, when it actually calls out, how does it say it? Verse 21, on an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, the voice of a God, not a man. I've read some commentaries that call out that the way this is phrased and what Herod is doing is pretty unique. And it seems like Herod is actually doing things to claim that he is a god. Like it seems like this is actually being done intentionally, and Herod is trying to solidify himself as more powerful than he really is. Mm-hmm. And then what happens is when the people start to worship him as a god, calling out, this is a god, not a man, he accepts all of it. And it's an interesting contrast, because we've seen in like just a few chapters before, when Peter shows up at Cornelius's house, the people actually try to worship him as a god. And Peter's like, no, you don't understand. I'm just a guy like you are. And there is only one God, and you need to follow him. Here, Herod, when the people do the same thing they did to Peter, they like fall down and worship him. Essentially, he accepts it and enjoys it, and so God kills him immediately.
Well, I think it was interesting leading up to that moment. There's a lot that happens in between, and I think I might have skipped over that a little bit, but it totally threw me when I read that. Like, oh my gosh! But what is crazy is that his intention, I'm sure, was to get rid of Peter just as much because he wanted to show the people who he was and how powerful he was. That did not work out. So what's interesting to me is that, although he killed James, he was intending on probably getting rid of Peter as well. Ultimately, his plans fell through. James' death was not in vain because he was like known to be like this martyr of the faith, which like essentially encourages even us today. He loses Peter. He gets real mad about it, and then it's just like, well, I'm so awesome, and turns around and God just like strikes him dead. So again, the whole idea of coming in between God and his plan will never work, because every one of these situations was all for God's glory. Although sad, gruesome, like pretty terrifying, every single one was for God's glory and not Herod's.
Yep, 100%. I guess the story about Peter being in prison is pretty straightforward. I mean, he's in prison. We've actually seen this play out before. He's in prison. God releases him from prison. What's interesting is that Peter, for a while, apparently assumes he's experiencing a vision, not a real situation.
I mean, it's so crazy. I would feel the same way. I would probably be feeling like, am I hallucinating right now?
Well,
I don't want to
not hallucinating, like a vision from God.
Right, but like hallucination is not real. This was very real. Like this was actually happening.
Also, you can have some grace for him when like he just 2 chapters ago did have a pretty significant vision from God, and it seemed very real, but it wasn't. Like, it was a vision. Right,
but even God spoke to him in that dream and like gave him direction. This is like, holy cow. Like, I'm fully conscious right now. This is actually happening.
So he goes to meet with the disciples, with some of the early Christians, and dear Rhoda is so overwhelmed by the fact that he's no longer in prison. She's like, doesn't even let him in. But eventually he does get in. He encourages them. You get this picture of people who are against God are constantly trying to stop what the church is doing. And despite all of those efforts to stop what God is doing, God is encouraging and strengthening and leading his people. And where they could be distraught over all these terrible things are happening, I guess they are affected by all these terrible things that are happening. The fact that God continues to move in powerful ways just encourages them and causes their numbers to grow and causes their faith to strengthen. So it's pretty interesting to see how God was doing that in the book of Acts, but also God clearly continues to do that today.
Well, and they never ceased with their efforts. So like, although they weren't going to like storm the prison and like get Peter out. In verse 5, it says Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. And then we see later on throughout the chapter 2 that like these people were all gathered together and they were praying. Like they were praying for all these things that were going on, because I'm sure it was very unsettling, and like they were powerless. God gives them the power through like the prayers that they're offering, through the dedication that they have to like trusting in what he's going to do. So I don't know. I just think that's really cool. Like the church was definitely unified in order to like trust that God's going to do what he's going to do and protect his people.
I would say like one clear theme in the book of Acts, it's one that most people know and aware of, like the Holy Spirit moves in powerful ways across the book of Acts. Another very clear theme in the book of Acts is that people were praying a lot. Like it was a big deal to these early followers of Jesus to be praying consistently. When things were difficult, they would gather together on special occasions to pray. That's how they're all gathered. That's why they're all gathered when Peter shows up. But it was also just a part of their daily lives. So we talked about that a couple days ago. Like, we just encourage you to have a strong prayer habit. And I know today it's kind of stylish and fashionable to encourage you just to like pray for a very short period of time because it's easy. These folks were praying for pretty long periods of time.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure fasting was probably a big part of it too. I don't know that, but I feel like that's significant.
But it's called out over and over again. And so as we wrap up here, just one extra credit piece. John Mark is listed a couple times in this chapter, and he's going to become pretty prominent in the next couple of chapters. So he would have been, there is some debate about who specifically he is, and some debate about like if it's one person or two people, like is he the guy that wrote the book of Mark, or is he like a different guy? There's two different guys that were all disciples, all followers of Jesus, but might be two different people. Most likely he is the cousin of Barnabas, which is probably why he starts to accompany Barnabas. John Mark and Paul are not going to get along. We'll see that story play out. And then at the end of their lives, they do reconcile. We'll see that story play out. So pay attention to Barnabas, pay attention to John Mark, pay attention to Paul. All these stories are going to come together and be a pretty significant part of how God is moving across the book of Acts.
So something that we can take away for today's episode for your part is the power of prayer, whether it is you specifically going through a situation that is impacting you significantly. The power of prayer is not just something that we just do out of, what's the word I want? Like as like a Hail Mary or a life wrapped kind of situation. It's something that we need to be constantly in communication with God, because I think sometimes we find ourselves in those situations and we're like, oh God, save me. Whereas I wonder how much if we were actually in prayer, even before the incident happened, that when it did happen to us, we're like, okay, I can see how you're working in my life right now. It might make more sense. How about that? So just, I would say, consider your prayer life, whether it be praying for situations that you are in yourself, praying for others who are around you, and really, really take the time, whether it means starting today or continuing something that you have been doing for a while, to really consider your prayer life and dedicate the time to the Lord in prayer that we saw this early church doing so diligently, because they understood the power and necessity for prayer. So thanks for joining us for today's episode. We'll be back again tomorrow with chapter 13. Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us, as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
Acts chapter 12. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of the unleavened bread, and when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. Now when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands, and the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and followed him. He did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought that he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them on its own accord, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent this angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod, and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting it was so, and they kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." Then he departed and went to another place. Now when the day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. But the word of God increased and multiplied, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.